Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and welcome back to Meta Monday, the weekly series where we analyze the Pokemon TCG Pocket metagame, and we let you guys know everything that's going on in the competitive world of Pokemon TCG Pocket. This is a big one this week. Week 3 of the Celestial Guardians format, and a lot has gone on over this last weekend. Of course, every week we review the tournament results of the largest weekly tournament series. However, this week it was different. We talked about it on Friday. It was the $10,000 Grails GG Ursa Days tournament. Almost 3,000 people competed in this tournament, and the results were definitely a little bit surprising. We're going to get right into it in this video, guys. We're going to talk about all of the deck lists, why some decks did well, why some decks didn't do well, what the overall metagame looks like right now, and I think we should get a very good understanding of what Pokemon Pocket from a metagame perspective looks like, again, going into this third week of the Celestial Guardians format. Very different in week 3 than I really expected us to be after that first week or two, but things change rapidly, and one thing I will say is that this is by far, in my mind, the greatest format, the greatest metagame that we've had so far in Pokemon TCG Pocket. That's what I'm going to preface this video by saying. You guys can see it up on the screen. These are the final standings. Now, there was a little bit of confusion, in terms of them hosting the tournament and putting in the results onto the Play.Limitless platform. I believe everything that we're going to take a look at today is accurate in terms of the placements and the standings and everything, so I think we should be all good, but keep that in mind. There was a little bit of confusion during the tournament, and that happens. I'm not discrediting anybody, but I believe everything here on the screen is accurate. And yes, this is the final standings, guys. These were the decks that did the best, that ended up with the best record after 3,000 people. One thing I will say is that I believe we cut from 3,000 people down to 32 for top cut in day 2. Of course, a very narrow bracket there. However, we'll take a look at all of the decks that did make day 2, and we'll go into the metagame data and the meta shares and the win rates, all of that stuff. But first off, let's take a look at the final standings. And again, comment below if anything surprised you guys, because there's going to be a lot of interesting info in this particular video today. And yeah, let's just dive right into it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Like I said, always 80% of you guys that watch my videos aren't subscribed. So if that's one of you guys, if you're watching this and you're not subscribed, go ahead and consider hitting that subscribe button. I would appreciate it. Let's get right into this. So number 1 is Narumi from France, and this was the winner of this 3,000 player tournament, and it was Magnezone and Oricorio. Okay, so that's, again, a surprise to me. I made a video Friday talking about the decks that I thought were the best decks to play for competition, and I'll just, if you haven't seen that video, I'll let you know right now, Magnezone and Oricorio was not on that list. In fact, basically, Magnezone and Oricorio actually did get second place at the first Ursa Days tournament of this particular format, but it hasn't been a deck list that I've really put a lot of weight into. I think there's other better ways to play Oricorio, and Magnezone as a card is definitely a strong card, but it's not something that I really kind of tier up really highly, at least in the format, and I still don't. But there's one reason in particular why Magnezone and Oricorio, I believe, did so well in this tournament. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Let's take a look at the deck list for Magnezone and Oricorio. One big difference here is the inclusion of Shaman. This is going to give Oricorio a lot of extra legs as it pertains to staying alive in that Giratina and Darkrai matchup. Now, some Giratina Darkrai's are playing Kamala, or they're playing some other kind of, variants or tech inclusions to maybe, help that matchup against Oricorio, things like Greninja. Sometimes we're even seeing Darkrai and Giratina paired with the Arceus Crobat combination that is floating around a little bit, but what Shaman does in the Oricorio matchup, it effectively reduces that 20 damage that you take every turn from the Darkrai ping down to 10 damage, and that is going to extend the lifespan of your Oricorio massively, especially if they don't have an attacking option that they can deal with. Magnezone is a good Pokemon, but it's a little bit underwhelming considering the entire field of play. It's not necessarily super great into most of those Stage 2 EX Pokemon. It is going to get one-hit KO'd by a lot of things like Charizard, like Incineroar, right? So there's 140 HP is a decent amount. Now, we do have Giant Cape to bring that to 160, but ultimately, as far as, Magnezone goes, I don't necessarily think it's a great Pokemon. One thing it does have going for it is that you can one-hit KO your opponent's Greninjas, Oricorios, Shamans, Kamalas, Tapu Leles. So it does hit that damage threshold against a lot of the non-EX Pokemon that are relevant in the format, but overall, this deck list to me never was as good as the Greninja Giratina variant. However, it is still Oricorio, so it is going to have at least a winning matchup against a lot of prominent decks in the format. But one matchup in particular that Magnezone does so well in is, something that was very common in day 2 of this tournament, which we'll take a look at in just a little bit. This deck list here, pretty standard as, a lot of these deck lists go. Again, we did play one Shaman, so we had to cut something out of the deck. 2 Professor's Research, 2 Pokeball, 1 Pokemon Communications. I think that's fine. No Rare Candy. You might be wondering, Magnezone is a Stage 2 Pokemon. Why aren't we playing Rare Candy? That's because we're actually reliant on Magnezone Magnezone to accelerate those energies to yourself with a Volt Charge. So we kind of bypass all that. And yes, the deck can feel a little bit slow, especially if we don't draw, that stage 1 and stage 2 Pokemon in the right timing. But in a lot of matchups, Oricorio can kind of stall things out a little bit, which is, again, kind of alleviates some of that pacing, issue that I guess Magnezone does have. And a lot of the other Stage 2 decks aren't necessarily, they can be explosive, but for the most part, if Oricorio's in the active spot, you're immune to a lot of those Stage 2 EX Pokemon anyway. 1 Lele to heal up the Magnezone, which, again, can be relevant. 160 plus 60 healing with Lele is actually quite a bit, especially against maybe, other Pokemon, particularly, again, like we'll see, a particular grass Pokemon, could be relevant. Mars, and then 1 Cyrus, 1 Guzma, and then again 2 Giant Capes. So fairly standard list here. A couple of tech inclusions. Mars, I think, is probably going to see play in a lot of different decks in the format, if not already seeing play in basically every deck. It's just nice to have it. It's good in the late game, but also it's really the only thing that allows you to kind of catch back up on card advantage or negate your opponent's card advantage after they draw cards with things like Professor's Research. And Guzma probably does help in a variety of different scenarios. I like playing Guzma in Oricorio decks specifically because a lot of those, Giratina Darkrai decks are playing things like Rocky Helmet, so it can feel a little bit bad to have to hit into a Pokemon with Rocky Helmet, especially since, we would rather not take any damage. Oricorio doesn't have a lot of HP, and against, Darkrai specifically, they're doing 20 damage every turn anyway with the Nightmare Aura ability. So that comes up to 40 damage, so that's a lot. So Guzma's really good to get rid of those Rocky Helmets in really all Oricorio decks, but Guzma's just a really nice win condition card in its own right, and it's kind of taken the place of Red in the format. I think there's more scenarios where we would rather play Guzma than Red. That's a big reason why we don't see Red see that much play. Also, there's a lot of non-EX Pokemon in the format, to be fair. Some decks do still play Red, but I think Guzma in general is actually a better card than Red. But anyway, this is the first place, the highest placing, I guess, deck of the tournament, which was Magnezone and Oricorio, which is really interesting. But if we go down, we'll take a look at the other deck, which you'll actually see pretty well populated everywhere in this day 2, and that is actually going to be Decidueye with Meowscarada. And now this is the deck list that, in my mind, actually really outperformed every other deck in the tournament. Even though it didn't get first place, it was by far the most successful deck of this tournament. Depending on how you categorize things, of course, you would rather be in first place than second place or third place. But when you take a look at the archetype as a whole, and you take a look at how many people won games, what its win percentage was, how many placements it had in Top Cut, Decidueye, Meowscarada, the definitive sort of grass deck of this format, was by far the most successful deck of this format. Now let's go ahead and take a look at it, because that's sort of what I was talking about, right, with Magnezone, is like, why did Magnezone do so well in this tournament? Well, in my mind, and my justification of it, is that it's particularly really good against Meowscarada decks, because Magnezone does 110 damage no matter what. It's also got 140 HP, similar to Meowscarada. However, Meowscarada only does 60 damage to your opponent's Magnezone, so it's much easier to get the 2-hit KOs when you're playing Magnezone. It just wins in the head-to-head matchup against Meowscarada. I do think Meowscarada is better against most of those EX Pokemon, things like Giratina, things like Darkrai, and all of the other EX Pokemon, of course, because we hit for 130 damage for only 2 energies. But realistically, Magnezone in that head-to-head matchup is much better. And we do have 1 Decidueye, but then our opponent does have Oricorio, which is immune to Decidueye. So in the head-to-head matchup, I do think that Magnezone and Oricorio does specifically really well against this grass deck, which otherwise was kind of the #1 meta call and the #1 most successful deck of this particular metagame. And I think that's a really big talking point here. I know Magnezone and Oricorio did win the tournament, but one thing I will talk about more than anything in this video is grass and its position in the metagame right now, which I think is probably the #1 most significant change from the previous weeks, is that grass is realistically kind of at the top. It really is kind of the top kind of counterplay to the other, types of decks that were kind of dominating in the first couple of weeks. But anyway, here's the second place Decidueye and Meowscarada deck, which is playing 2 Sprigatito, 2 Meowscarada, and then 1 Florigato, and then a 1/1/1 line for Rowlet, Dartrix, and Decidueye. That's fairly standard. That's what we see in most of these Meowscarada and Decidueye decks. 2 Ericas and 1 Lily, so a lot of healing in here with 2 Leaf Cape. This deck is all about sustain, right? Staying alive, not only boosting the HP of Meowscarada up to 170, but Decidueye up to 200, and then that healing with Ericas is nice. I think that overall Erica is a better card than Lily, mainly because we can heal our Pokemon even if they aren't fully evolved, which does definitely come in handy sometimes, and it is only 10 HP less healing than Lily. Lily is just a little bit more conditional. Of course, 60 is better than 50, but it's better to be able to heal at least a little bit than not at all, right? So 2 Ericas, 1 Lily is interesting to me. That's a lot of healing. And then no Pokemon communications in this deck, but 2 Rare Candy, of course. and then 1 red card, 2 research, 2 Pokeball. So not a lot of like ancillary kind of tech inclusions as far as trainers go. It really is kind of all in on the consistency and then just the overall core strategy with a bunch of healing and extra HP that we get from Leaf Cape, which I do think is probably the #1 advantage of these grass type decks, is that with Leaf Cape and then with Erica's, it's just so much HP, so much healing that against archetypes that don't necessarily have the potential to 1-hit KO your Pokemon, you're kind of in a really good spot. And I think that Meowscarada is an extremely good Pokemon, no matter how you slice it, especially in a format that's heavily dominated by things like, you know, Decidueye, or not Decidueye, like Darkrai, like Giratina, even like Arceus, which was, again, another top deck of the format. Meowscarada is really well positioned, and of course, we do have the Cry for Help Sprigatito, which is a really, really great Pokemon. It allows you to find your grass Pokemon and thin your deck out. Rare Candy, again, giving this deck a little bit more pace, and I've said it in previous weeks that grass is potentially the most well-positioned deck in the format, and I'm listen, you can go back. I've said this last week and maybe even the previous weeks, is that the grass decks are extremely well-positioned, and they have been against really the most popular decks of the format. The only downside to this deck list, truthfully, is that early on in the format, fire decks were seeing a lot more play. In fact, I think in the first week or two, fire was one of the most popular decks, whether it was Charizard, Incineroar, whatever have you. So grass or fire decks were really common, which is certainly something that Meowscarada can struggle with, although I don't think it's even that bad of a matchup. But also in that same vein, I just don't think that the deck has inherently enough consistency, or I should say as much consistency as some of the other top decks do. Realistically, there's just a lot of red card. There's a lot of red card. There's a lot of Mars in the format, a lot of hand disruption, which is something that this deck really doesn't like to deal with. Sprigatito is your lead, right? You can Cry for Help. This is, by the way, I will say this is a deck list that loves to go second. Going first, this deck is significantly worse than going second, but that's nothing new to Pokemon Pocket. So top decks, since the beginning of Pokemon Pocket history, have all been pretty reliant on going second, which is, you know, just sort of how it goes. Going second in general is better than going first, but particularly with this deck, it definitely likes to go second. But Sprigatito, we Cry for Help, we thin our deck, we find our Pokemon, and then we could potentially evolve a little bit earlier or more consistently than we otherwise would. However, a lot of hand disruption in a lot of decks, specifically all of the Giratina Darkrai decks. So you would think that a deck list like this, with so many of its opponents playing hand disruption cards, would struggle a little bit. But again, it's just so well positioned, and it's a good enough deck. It's got enough tech support here with the healing, with the Leaf Cape, that it really is just like a really good option, even against, like, you know, decks that are playing Mars and red card. It's just good enough, especially in those Giratina Darkrai decks, in those matchups where it just kind of makes sense. Meowscarada is also good into Oricorio. Oricorio is not going to be able to stand up to Meowscarada. Again, with the Leaf Cape, with the Ericas, we're doing 60 damage per turn, which isn't enough to KO an Oricorio, but they're not going to live long enough to KO our Meowscarada. So that's sort of effectively the big reason why I think Meowscarada is so well positioned. It's really good against the dark type Pokemon like Darkrai. It's good against Giratina after Giratina attacks. Meowscarada can come in, hit for 130, and unless they have a giant cape or anything like that, you know, you're able to take the KO. Also, with Leaf Cape, we're able to basically live an attack from Giratina and Darkrai, which is relevant, all of the healing. So it's really good matchups into the whole Giratina Darkrai package, which of course is still really common in the format, but also good against Oricorio, which is sort of the #1 counterplay to Giratina Darkrai. So it makes sense that the grass decks here, and this one in particular with Meowscarada, and I would say that this is the best way to play Meowscarada, is to pair it with like the 1 Decidueye. There's just enough scenarios where like we would rather have like 2 Meowscarada than like 1 Meowscarada into Decidueye in a lot of matchups, but sometimes we do go Meowscarada into Meowscarada, and then our opponent still has to deal with Decidueye, which again, with all of the healing, all of the Leaf Cape, it's just too much for most people to handle. But realistically, the most well-positioned deck in Pokemon Pocket right now, and I'm really glad that we saw this have such a great performance. And I'll just go ahead and I'll showcase to you guys what I mean by a great performance. Is that if we go to the metagame tab and we go to playing to win, this is the distribution of decks, I believe, that made it into Top Cut, which is phenomenal if you take a look at the not only the win percentages, but the distribution. 27% of Top Cut was literally grass decks, like 35 Meowscarada Decidueye, more than any other deck. That's more than Giratina and Greninja decks, that's more than Giratina Darkrai decks, more than Fighting, more than Oricorio, more than Arceus. So it was by far the most successful deck in day one. And if we take a look at the metagame for the combined of the overall tournament, it was only 11% of the tournament meta share. So that's a very different distribution. We go from 11% of the tournament to 27% of Top Cut, which basically means grass decks were by far not only the most successful deck, but was realistically just the best option given the, you know, the scope of the metagame. And again, if we go back to the overall metagame, it makes sense, right? If you take a look here, Giratina and Darkrai was the most played deck, and we kind of assume that to be the case. Giratina and Greninja, this is, I believe, either Tapu Lele or Snorlax. I kind of forget. Limitless kind of messes up with how they categorize it, but either Snorlax or Tapu Lele was the second most played deck here, and then Meowscarada Decidueye was actually the third most, but a big difference here from 11% to 27%. That's a massive difference. Now, Giratina and Greninja went from 25, well, started at 18%, or 19 to 25. So it also had a really good showing in today's in the tournament. I would say probably the second most successful deck, but from Meowscarada to go from 11% to 27 is definitely a big deal. And the win percentage was really, really great. If we take a look at all of the other top decks and the average win percentage, we see that Giratina Darkrai struggled a bit, right? Just about 48% with 41 ties. So truthfully, I mean, it definitely lost more than it won, so that's something to keep in mind. But again, makes sense with how many people were playing grass in this tournament, right? The third most played deck. Giratina and Greninja decks with Tapu Lele or Snorlax were just about 50.5%, so a fairly decent showing for them, but nothing too substantial. And then Meowscarada at 54%. That's 1,100 wins, 900 losses. Definitely the most successful, well-performing deck. And then Arceus, Crobat right behind, truthfully, 8% of the meta share at a 52.5% win rate, and everything else was really kind of a bit low. If we go all the way down to Gallade with only 10 players, definitely a pretty high win rate, but a very, very small sample size. So anything that was a large sample size of this 3,000 player tournament was truthfully didn't perform extremely well. Magnezone and Oricorio did fairly good at 86 and 82, but that's literally a 50-50 win rate. And that's the other point as well. 26 people out of 3,000 or so only played Magnezone and Oricorio, so that's a very, very small percentage. Less than 1% of the tournament was playing this deck list. And then again, if we go to day 2, we see that, where is it? Oh, playing to win? We see that only 2 of them made top cut, but they had a 12-1 record, guys. So that's the difference between doing well in day 2 and in top cut and in Swiss rounds. When you're playing in Swiss rounds, you're playing against a variety of different opponents. But when you get into top cut, you're really playing against a very concentrated distribution of decks that did well in day 1. That, of course, being Meowscarada, Decidueye, Giratina, and Greninja, and then Giratina and Darkrai, right? That's like the vast majority. That's like over 60% or whatever of day 2 were those 3 decks, and Magnezone and Oricorio was specifically really good against those 3 decks. And I think that's a big reason why it went 92% in day 2. We can actually take a look at the matchups, I believe. No, this is just going to give us the overall matchups. But yeah, very good against Decidueye and Meowscarada, of course, 72%. Negative win rate, just literally 0 against Arceus and Crobat. Really good against Fire, and then fairly decent as well against Giratina and Darkrai. So this is a deck list that, again, was a really interesting meta call, and I'm not going to say it got lucky, but truthfully, it really was kind of that one deck that ended up actually being really good against the decks that performed the best in day 1. And that's really what the tournaments come down to. So that's why I always say, like, take the final standings with a grain of salt, because what it basically tells us is that, what deck had sort of the best collection of matchups for that day 2 sort of run, which, I guess really just ended up being Magnezone and Oricorio. And if we take a look at the day 2 matchups for the player that won the tournament, we can kind of see this reflected, right? We played Giratina Greninja, then we played 3 Meowscarada decks, then we played Giratina Darkrai, then we played the mirror match, and then we played Meowscarada in the finals, right? So really this player played 4 Meowscarada decks, and then if this particular player ended up losing in top 4 to the mirror match, then the other player playing this deck would have probably ended up winning the tournament, because they would have also played Meowscarada Decidueye. So that's really what it comes down to. And when I talk about the decks that I guess performed the best overall in the tournament, that's what I'm talking about, is that grass decks, in this particular grass deck, Meowscarada Decidueye, was by far the most successful deck of the tournament from a perspective of win rate and overall performance against the overall metagame. And what that means, truthfully, is that we're going to see a massive shift in the decks that see play and the distribution of those decks and what the metagame really means. And, again, it's very similar to that first week. If you guys were watching for that first tournament, that first weekend of the format where Snorlax ended up winning, Snorlax kind of took over the format because it really was the deck that won that first week, and everybody assumed it was a really good choice. But truthfully, at that time, Snorlax really wasn't like a top meta choice. It wasn't ever a top deck of the format. It was just really good specifically against the Oricorio decks, which kind of took out all of the other decks in day 2 for that particular tournament. And that's kind of what we saw in this particular week, is that Decidueye and Meowscarada really did kind of just blaze through day 2, by far the most successful deck overall. But then there was just a couple of those Magnezone Oricorio players that just kind of farmed all of those Meowscarada, who ended up doing really good in day 2. So That's really what it comes down to. Let's get back into the deck lists. We're going on a bit of a tangent, but there's a lot to talk about because this is a massive tournament, a massive undertaking, and I do think the meta is going to change a lot. This deck list here, coincidentally, is the exact same deck, I believe, just a different Rowlet. They're playing the Leafage Rowlet instead of the Skill Dive Rowlet. It really depends. Like it's not very often that you kind of lead Rowlet and then you go into Decidueye in turn 2 anyway. Like that doesn't oftentimes happen. So doing 20 damage to the active is kind of probably more relevant in most case scenarios. There are like the very few scenarios where we do go second, we lead the Skill Dive Rowlet, we can attack the bench and then go into Decidueye and then KO that bench Pokemon, but it's very, very rare that that happens, and Rowlet isn't a Pokemon that we're necessarily starting with all of the time anyway, so Rowlet might actually be better to play the Leafage Rowlet. Again, I just think it's very minimal, but that's really the only difference between this deck and the deck that got second place. Very, very much the same. Let's take a look here at this top 4 Magnezone and Oricorio deck, which again, I believe is almost the exact same. This version is actually a little bit different. We're playing a little bit more healing with Pokemon Center Lady. We're not playing Pokemon Communication, so a little bit less consistent in that sense. We do have one Mars, and then we're playing Iono. So instead of Pokecom, I think we have Iono, and I actually kind of forget. If we go back, what was this player running? He was playing Guzma and Giant Capes, so okay. So that's kind of the big difference. This player was also playing Giant Capes, but no Guzma, no Pokecom. We got Pokemon Center Lady and Iono. So, you know, again, like cards like that are going to improve certain scenarios, but for the most part, like it doesn't really matter. At least in this tournament, it didn't probably matter that much because against Meowscarada, like the healing, I guess, could be really good, but it probably wasn't like that big of a factor. It was just the fact that in the head-to-head, Magnezone just beats Meowscarada no matter really how you slice it. So, yeah, there you go. But anyway, interesting to see, of course, the differences between these two deck lists. And then if we go down from top 4, we do see King Hungry here from the United States went 12-2-1, and he was playing Giratina and Greninja. Unfortunately, Limitless has a hard time categorizing some of these Giratina Greninja decks because this is realistically Tapu Lele, and that's what we have in our minds, but Limitless says that it's Giratina and Greninja. But this is Tapu Lele, and I do think that if you're not playing like the Oricorio Giratina Greninja combination with Shaman, then I think this is the best option. This is kind of taken over for Snorlax, and I do think that this is potentially an S tier deck. I believe I put it in an S tier last week in the tier list, and I probably will tomorrow in tomorrow's tier list. I believe it's just a really, really good deck. And yes, it's obviously going to do a little bit less good into Meowscarada, but truthfully, it's still like a really top archetype. And then we, of course, still have Giratina and Darkrai. This player here, 7th place from the Netherlands. And this is a Giratina Darkrai deck that's not playing Kamala. So I guess what we can do, in fact, I will take a look at that in a little bit after we take a look at this deck. But this is like no Kamala, no Tech. It's just straight Giratina Darkrai with 16 trainer cards. We've got the Guzma, 1 Pokemon Center Lady, 1 red, 1 Leaf, 1 red card, 1 Mars, 1 Cyrus, 1 Giant Cape, and then 2 Rocky Helmet, 2 Sabrina, and I think that's probably somewhat correct as well. I think that early Sabrinas to get those damages off with Nightmare Aura is in general pretty good. But I still think that Giratina Darkrai is also still one of the best decks of the format. And you have to look at the overall metagame in the sense of like, okay, like what was the driving factor for the outcome of the tournament? Like why did grass decks do so well? And the reason why grass decks did so well was because they are good into, you know, a particular matchup against what I consider to be the best deck of the game in the format right now, which is Giratina Darkrai and then the other Giratina decks and Oricorio. And that's sort of what it comes down to. So people might be looking at this like, okay, grass is at the top of the metagame right now. Grass is the best deck of the game. But truthfully, it is sort of a counter meta pick, right? It's not the strongest deck in the game. It's not the most consistent deck in the game. It's just, I think right now, the most well-positioned deck in the format. And I think that's a big difference, right? So of course it's a really strong deck, but Giratina Darkrai is still like the deck. It's still what's really driving the whole metagame. It's what everything is sort of shaping around, which is certainly something to keep in mind. And if we go down, we have a couple of interesting inclusions here. We have got Sparza from the US, and he was playing Charizard and Incineroar. This is probably like the #1 way to play Fire right now. This is certainly a deck that's going to be really good into the Grass-type decks into Meowscarada, but at the same time, you know, Meowscarada and Decidueye can always beat the Fire decks, because if you do just kind of miss out on your evolutions, then Meowscarada is going to just beat you, right? And that's sort of what the Stage 2 Pokemon kind of come down as, where a lot of these Stage 2 rare candy decks, like, yes, like some matchups are better than others, but truthfully, the player who gets all of their Pokemon out more early or more consistently, or just, I guess, first, is who wins the game. And yes, Fire, of course, Charizard was going to be really good against Meowscarada and Decidueye, but truthfully, the matchup's very winnable for Grass, because they can just sort of get more lucky than you, and you can just not find your rare candies or your Stage 2 Pokemon, and then you lose. And that's unfortunately the reality of kind of the way that the format is built around right now. But interesting enough, there is in 9th place the highest ranking fire deck, and then right below it we did actually see a Solgaleo. Now I wouldn't put too much weight into this. Solgaleo is a deck that is still existent, but it has underperformed week after week after week. It shouldn't be a shock to you that at least one of them did place somewhat high in the tournament, but it's not something I would necessarily put that much weight into. Now you might also be wondering why we didn't see more fire if there was so much grass that saw play. Like in a scenario, it's like, okay, so if we go to Playing to Win and then we take a look at like the metagame, we'll see a couple of things. We'll see that there's like two Charizard and Incineroar decks. There's a Charizard Turtonator, there's an Infernape Turtonator. How come those decks didn't kind of blaze through the tournament like the Meowscarada and Oricorio did, kind of farming those matchups? And again, it probably comes down to luck, but we can go ahead and take a look here. We'll take a look at Sparza, and we'll take a look at his matchup. So we see that this player ended up only playing one Meowscarada Decidueye. He had to go through Greninja and Giratina twice, where he did win once. He did, of course, beat the Fire deck, and he did beat Giratina Darkrai, but then unfortunately did lose to this player here, King Hungry, which we just took a look at playing Tapu Lele. So unfortunately, this player just got a little bit less lucky than the Oricorio players did with Magnezone, where they didn't necessarily hit those decks that they're really, really good against. And that's, again, what day 2 really kind of comes down to is a little bit of the luck in terms of the matchups that you hit. It could have very well been the Fire decks that ended up hitting only Meowscaradas and just ended up winning the tournament. Could have easily been them, but it just didn't kind of fall that way. The dice didn't roll that way. And unfortunately, that's just sort of how it happened, right? Who was the other player? Was it this Jugo here? It must be. So let's take a look here. Yeah, so he also hit Giratina Darkrai round 1 in top 128 was the top cut bracket, by the way. So there you go. But anyway, yeah, it just also got a little bit unlucky. And that's sort of what it comes down to, right? Fire definitely could have been that deck that also popped off. Now, the overall win rates, right, and the distribution of Fire compared to the other decks, meaning that in Swiss rounds, they just didn't do very well. Charizard Turtonator was 46%, and then Charizard Incineroar was 48%. So it really did feel like the Fire deck struggled against most of the other things in the format that weren't grass. Of course, probably did well against the grass decks, but Magnezone and Oricorio, I think, just was a little bit better against the decks that also weren't grass. You know what I mean? So it just had a little bit of a better opportunity than the Fire decks did, even though the same amount of them made day 2, but you know, again, it kind of all comes down to being a little bit lucky in terms of the matchups that you hit, for sure. And if we go down here, some other interesting inclusions. There was a Meowscarada and Beedrill deck. Now, again, I like Beedrill, but it's like, would we rather be playing Beedrill as that last Pokemon on our line of defense than Decidueye? I don't know. I mean, I think Beedrill's totally fine, but I don't necessarily think it's like as good. Now, theoretically, here we are playing 2 of the Beedrill and none of the Stage 1 evolution, which is an interesting kind of build to the deck. If we do lead with Weedle, it does kind of increase our odds of at least being able to rare candy into the Beedrill, which is really good going second on an early turn. But again, the deck is probably, realistically, if I had to take a look at this deck list, I would just assume that it got carried by Meowscarada. So that's one thing to keep in mind. A lot of the Meowscarada decks are playing Decidueye, and it is going to come in handy in a lot of matchups, but these are decks that probably just got carried by Meowscarada and how well positioned it was into the format right now. Probably one of the most well-positioned Pokemon in the game, if not the most well-positioned Pokemon, at least for this last weekend of tournaments it was. So things might change, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. I'm sure things will probably change a lot given the results of this tournament, and people's opinions on the metagame will change a lot. But really interesting to see how different of an outcome this tournament had from the previous weeks, which realistically Grass just didn't have that much of an opportunity to kind of slide in. But Fire kind of taking a big decline, and Grass realistically seeing a lot more play really has opened, I think, the format up and opened people's eyes to like that Grass truthfully is a lot better than Fire. But for whatever the reason, everybody just kind of wanted to play Fire early in the format. They were really hype about Stoke Charizard or Incineroar or whatever. So Fire, again, massively seeing a decline in play, whereas this weekend Grass saw a lot of play. And you might be wondering as well, if we guess we can just kind of maybe, assume, why did Grass jump up to the 3rd most played deck? How come Meowscarada Decidueye was, 11% of the meta share, where in previous weeks it really wasn't that much? I think it kind of chalks down to probably its performance in the smaller tournaments the week leading up to this tournament. I do believe that Meowscarada won like a 300 or 400 player Frog EX tournament earlier in the week. It might have also done well in terms of a win rate in last weekend's Ursa Days tournament. So I think for whatever the reason, enough people made the idea to switch to Meowscarada and Decidueye. Maybe there were some content creators talking about it. I did also play this deck on ladder like last week. It was something that I understood to be pretty well positioned, but yeah, interesting enough that it was the 3rd most played deck. and was by far the most popular deck in day 2, which again, it's all just interesting to see how things have changed from week to week. Let's go down in the standings because there was a Garchomp deck which we can take a look at, and I like Garchomp. I really do. I believe it was about 51% win rate for the tournament. Garchomp is still really good. I just think that, again, with grass seeing a lot of play, and I guess we'll talk about the grass matchup because it's actually not that bad of a matchup for Garchomp. Interestingly, yes, all of our Pokemon are weak to grass, but again, Meowscarada doesn't hit for the full damage against Rampardos, right? It only hits for 60, which is 80 for weakness, but Rampardos for 1 energy does 130. So in the head-to-head matchup, Rampardos is definitely beating Meowscarada out, but Garchomp definitely does not like Meowscarada. But again, with Garchomp is that, truthfully, we can kind of damage the bench. We can do a lot of extra stuff here. Rampardos is certainly a card that is not that bad against the Meowscarada matchup, but Garchomp could be a little bit, a little bit suspect. But we're not playing the Grass Gibble either, or the Fighting type Gibble, which is weak to Grass, which is definitely an upside. But I don't know. I guess we could take a look at the data because Garchomp is interesting, and I do feel like it's not terrible into grass, but maybe the data says otherwise. Like, to be fair, I'm kind of just like assuming. Okay, yeah, it is a 26% win rate, which is, I guess, pretty bad. But on paper, it shouldn't be, I guess, that terrible. But I mean, that is a pretty bad matchup. I mean, I was thinking it wasn't like a 0% win rate, but that's pretty bad. 27% is pretty bad for sure. So I like Garchomp, and in fact, I think it's totally fine. Again, 51% win rate for the tournament. With quite a big sample size. It's, unfortunately, I think that grass was pretty popular, and other things in the format maybe are just a little bit of a better decision to play than fighting. Of course, we're going to be good against Oricorio, but not as many people are playing Oricorio than you might think, if we're being honest with you. Yeah, that one player did fairly well. Got 18th place, went 10-1-2. So definitely a pretty good record. And if we go down here, there was a Gallade deck. Yeah, 27th. Now, Gallade is an interesting one. It's seen some play from time to time. It's not a deck that I think a lot of people have been playing. It's not a deck that I think is necessarily that well positioned. But again, you got to take a look at it. It's a fighting deck, right, that is playing Rampardos, but we're not weak to grass. So you're like, okay, cool. Like, at least we're not, like, getting absolutely destroyed by a lot of those grass decks. There's not a lot of Pokemon in the format that have a ton of energies, right? Unfortunately, Gallade is weak to Psychic, and there's Tapu Lele in the format. There's also Giratina, which can just kind of one-hit KO Gallade. So it's a little bit awkward. I don't know how much I really believe in Gallade. One appearance here high up in the rankings and in day 2 is certainly impressive, but it's not something I would necessarily put a ton of stock into. But there is Gallade, so shout out to Gallade. And now here's an interesting one, and I've seen this kind of floating around a little bit, which is kind of aggro Psychic, right? And this is basically Tapu Lele, but instead of like pairing it with sort of the Giratina Greninja package, we're just playing it with like a collection of pretty decent non-EX Psychic Pokemon. That being, of course, the new Oricorio, which acts like a Marshadow. It's a really strong Pokemon. I think that Tapu Lele and Oricorio pair pretty well. And I've seen Banette see play in this particular list, but this player was playing Gengar, and this is like the newest Gengar, I think, with Hypnoblast. So it's not the Bother Gengar, and it's not Gengar EX, but it's the Hypnoblast Gengar, which does 70 damage and your opponent's asleep. Now, again, for 2 energies, 140 HP, is actually a pretty strong, attack here. There's a lot of Pokemon Center Lady that sees play, but a lot of the grass decks aren't playing it. So, I mean, sleep is what it is, but 70 damage for 2 energies isn't terrible. On 140 HP, it's something that we can rare candy into. And again, it's something that we can have on the back line while we kind of chip down our opponent with Tapu Lele and Oricorio, right? So even if it is the last Pokemon that we go into, it's probably not that bad of a Pokemon whatsoever. So I actually really like this deck, and I think that Tapu Lele and Oricorio and Psychic, sort of these aggro Psychic decks, are actually a bit better than you might think. And it kind of makes sense. When you come back around and you take a look at like how Bayonet's done over the last few weeks, it all sort of makes a little bit of sense as to why those decks were so good, because they play Tapu Lele and stuff. And Tapu Lele is just really, really good. If we go down a little bit, there's going to be a lot of really interesting decks that made day 2. Here is, I believe, what we were talking about earlier, which is the Crobat Arceus deck. This is a bit different. We're not playing Giratina in this list, but we've seen some iteration of Crobat Arceus all over the place. Now, I think the most common version was playing Carnivine and Grass Energies, but I never really loved that list because it was a bit reliant on Carnivine. And when you're playing Grass Energies, that means you can't actually attack with Crobat, and it just kind of feels a little bit awkward. But when you pair Arceus and Crobat with Darkrai, you can play only Dark Energies, and then you can't attack with Crobat, and of course, we have the Nightmare Aura damage. So that is effectively 50 damage per turn, right, between the Nightmare Aura and Crobat. Crobat's Cunning Link ability, so that's 50 damage to the active Pokemon, which is certainly strong. But if we do have that energy on Crobat, then that is actually 100 damage, right? 50 plus the 50, so that's a lot. And truthfully, it's a deck list that definitely can win games. Now, we are weak to grass for Darkrai, but Arceus and Crobat are actually weak to fighting, so keep that in mind. I just personally think that the Crobat Arceus combo is a little bit awkward. And again, if you do lead with Arceus, it can feel a bit bad. But we are playing, of course, one copy of Lima and one copy of Leaf to get out of the active spot if we do lead with the small Arceus or the large Arceus. You might be wondering why we're playing the small Arceus and not just like 2 of the big Arceus. Like why play 2 copies of the small one? I don't necessarily know if it's that much better. Theoretically, you know, if you have a Pokemon that's stuck in the active spot that you don't want in the active spot, you would probably rather it be a non, 2 prize Pokemon, a non-EX Pokemon. It only has 20 HP less, and effectively, you know, if it does get KO'd, your opponent only takes 1 prize instead of 2. So that is somewhat a bit better, truthfully. But also, like, you got to think about the lineup, right? Darkrai might not be necessarily something that we want to attack with, but Arceus, of course, being this Arceus not being an EX Pokemon means that we can technically go like, we can set up the Arceus, we can attack, force our opponent to KO this Arceus, and then we can maybe go into Crobat, and then finally go off into like a Darkrai or Arceus. So it's just sort of, that same thing with like the Meowscarada decks where you kind of want to force your opponent to go through like 2 non-EX Pokemon before they have to go through an EX Pokemon. Interesting nonetheless that the highest ranking, I think, Crobat deck was not playing Carnivine. I believe, right? Yeah, it was this deck list. Was there any Arceus Carnivine or Crobat up here? No, there really wasn't. So that's interesting. The highest ranking Crobat deck was pure Dark, and it wasn't actually playing Carnivine at all. We got to wrap up this video in a little bit, but this is going to be Togekiss, and Togekiss is a funny one. It's been on the tier list for a couple of weeks now. It's a real Pokemon. It's a real deck. Cynthia with Togekiss, Tapu Lele, Oricorio. Again, that really aggro psychic core of Tapu Lele and Oricorio is just pretty good. It's good enough to where we can kind of pair a lot of different psychic Pokemon with it and have a decent enough chance against most decks of the format. Togekiss and Tapu Lele they're both weak to metal, and Solgaleo and metal decks really aren't that common, so it's kind of cool, and I actually think that Togekiss is better than people think it is, but again, you gotta chalk it up to that really aggressive kind of core package of Tapu Lele and Oricorio, which is a lot better in the format than I think a lot of people give it credit for. It's just actually a really, really strong Pokemon, Tapu Lele is. If we go down here, we do find 1 Carnivine in RC stack, so at least there was 1 up here in like top 32. And again, this is a deck list that always has a strong performance in terms of its win rates. It's topped a lot of the last couple of tournaments. It just hasn't won anything yet. This tournament, it didn't necessarily do as well. I think it probably got taken over by the other grass deck, being Meowscarada and Decidueye, but certainly a really strong deck that I'm not really surprised, I guess, to see it up here. I am actually surprised to only see 1 of them here at 36th place. And if we go down, there's probably a couple of more. Here's Charizard and Turtonator. Let's take a quick look at this list. This is a deck that I actually love. Theoretically, Turtonator is good against Oricorio, where Charizard is not very good against Oricorio. And of course, Charizard is just in general a good Pokemon against a lot of other matchups. So theoretically, against Oricorio and against the grass decks, this deck should do good, but it struggles with its consistency. If we don't find Kiawe, then, leading off with Turtonator just kind of feels bad. And of course, like after Turtonator does go down, we have to at least wait a turn to stoke with Charizard before we can then attack with it. So that's why we're playing 1 copy of Red, because we really do need to take that KO with Charizard, or else we're just not really winning the game. Other thing to keep in mind is that Decidueye with a Leaf Cape is at 200 HP, which means that Charizard cannot KO you, even with Red. You hit for 190, so keep that in mind. Shout out to Charizard. Anyway, what do we have? We also have an Incineroar, or not Incineroar, sorry, an Infernape Turtonator deck. They function quite similarly, in fact. So, I mean, I don't know. This isn't a deck that I've actually played myself, but I mean, theoretically, we don't have to go in and stoke, right? If we Kiawe onto a Turtonator, we can then attach maybe to an Infernape, and then we can kind of just go off from there and not have to wait a turn to attack with Infernape. So 140, again, also an awkward amount of HP. Like, we're not KOing a Meowscarada with Leaf Cape. So again, it's just a bit awkward. These fire Pokemon, in my mind, just don't do enough damage. I've always said that about Charizard and Incineroar, is that they're just a little bit awkward in terms of how much damage they do, and I just don't think they hit the right thresholds or enough, they just don't do enough damage to really justify that much playing Pokemon that can't take 1 KOs, right? But yeah, that's kind of it in terms of the deck lists and the standings. Now, one thing I'm just going to talk about quickly, and again, we'll go back to the metagame tab, and now we'll talk a little bit about why I think the format is going to be changing and how it's going to be changing and what this kind of really means for the metagame of Pokemon Pocket for the upcoming week or so. One thing to note is that like grass is here and it's fully arrived now. I think that fire might actually kind of rise back up in play because grass is likely seeing a ton of play. But theoretically, grass decks should be still like the most overall well-positioned deck in the format. I think a lot of people are still really adamant on playing Oricorio, on playing Giratina, on playing Darkrai, even playing Tapu Lele, playing Garchomp and fighting. There's a lot of decks, a lot of the top decks of the format. Meowscarada is really, really good into. So there's an agreed upon sort of best grass deck right now that has not only been winning a ton, but having good win rates and just sort of performing well in tournaments. So I think it's really on the radar, and I would expect grass decks to be sort of a top 2, top 3 deck in next week and for the future. And that's a pretty big deal because what it does is it really kind of puts a little bit of a limiter, especially even more than what we had before, on a lot of the Giratina decks that were kind of taking over the format. And it did kind of look like that was going to be the case, but things do eventually come around, and I'm glad to see it. So grass has always been really, really strong. It's always been well positioned. And I think now, after 3 weeks, people have sort of caught on and they've really kind of adjusted to it. And it's something that we're going to have to keep in mind. But because Meowscarada and grass decks are seeing so much more play, and they're going to be so much more relevant at the top of the metagame, it really is going to open things up again for some of these fire decks to be a little bit more relevant. And if the fire decks see more play, then maybe, Oricorio also has a little bit more of an opportunity to slide in. So it really feels like we're in sort of a more than just sort of a simple kind of rock, paper, scissors format. I still truthfully believe, and again, we've talked about this in the previous meta report videos and in all of our videos, is that the format with the inclusion of Oricorio was split into 3 categories, whereas before we really only had 2 categories. And I'm not here to like praise Oricorio, but what I'm saying is that the state of the metagame right now, even though some people hate Oricorio as a card, is kind of all chalked up to Oricorio. Traditionally, what we had in formats was we had the decks that were just inherently the best decks, the strongest decks, and then you maybe had like 1 or 2 decks that were strong against that top deck, and they all sort of vied for themselves. You had, the split down into 2 categories. You had the inherently really strong decks, the meta, and then you had like the counter meta that was really good against those decks. Now things are different because we have Oricorio. And what Oricorio does is it splits it down into like 3 categories. And in this format, what we have are the inherently really, really strong decks, like the best decks. And then we have Oricorio, which for the most part is good against those inherently really strong decks. But then we have that third category, which is sort of that counter meta, which is again good against Oricorio, but also good against, maybe also good against the non-Oricorio decks. So it's sort of this rock, paper, scissors kind of 3-way thing. But what we're seeing now is that, the Pokemon that are in the driver's seat, or I guess sort of like what is meta, like for day 2 of this tournament, what was the metagame was grass. So what ended up beating the grass decks was the Oricorio decks that were good against the decks that were good against the inherently strong decks, being Giratina, Darkrai. So it all kind of comes back around full circle, but depending on what deck is sort of the most played, or I guess the most common, or I guess the, in the driver's seat of the metagame, then there's going to be sort of a counter meta and then a counter to the counter meta, and that's really what it comes down to. So I think you can chalk that down to a format like this, and I think it's really healthy for the game because there realistically is like 10 or 12 decks that are all really significantly positioned in the metagame to at least win or have good matchups against popular decks, and I think that's really, really healthy. So things are going to kind of cycle and change as the weeks go on, but again, this week, Giratina and Darkrai and Giratina and Greninja, the 2 most played decks. So the number 1 best option in day 2, or the most successful deck, was Meowscarada, but the deck that ended up winning the tournament was one of those decks that was really good against Meowscarada in day 2, that of course being Magnezone and Oricorio. So it's interesting. Now, do I think that Magnezone and Oricorio will end up being, like the most played deck next week? It certainly is going to see a lot more play, which is going to keep the grass decks a little bit more in check. So I would expect grass to still see a ton of play next week, but Magnezone and Oricorio will probably end up seeing a lot of play as well. So then, other things kind of slide in, right? And we might have a rock, paper, scissors sort of formulation between the fighting decks, the grass decks, and then the Magnezone Oricorio decks. But things will, again, come around full circle, and then the Giratina decks will still end up being really good. So I think things are a little bit too complex to really kind of guess exactly what's going to happen in the metagame and what the best meta calls are. But you can really go back and in hindsight take a look at why things happen the way they did and really kind of chalk things down to like how certain decks interact with each other. But I'm really, really glad at least that 3 weeks into the format, things are really kind of broken wide open. And again, there's so many decks that are all really relevant. The win rates might tell you otherwise. Like, of course, there's a lot of decks below 50% win rate, but a deck that had a 46% or 48% win rate this week might have a 52% win rate next week. It really kind of all depends on what sees a lot of play. And again, average win rate isn't the most important thing in general, right? Some of the most important things are, your matchups into decks that are specifically going to do well in day 2, right? That's how you end up winning tournaments. But we don't just take a look at what decks won the tournaments. We take a look at, what decks overall performed the best this week. The story really was Meowscarada. It really was the grass-type decks because they really did kind of really cement themselves into the metagame as perhaps probably the most impressively well-positioned deck to play right now. And it is certainly really, really good. Now, I do think they have their consistency issues, which we talked about, but, a lot of that stuff doesn't matter if you're just good against the decks that people are playing. That's really what it comes down to. So, yeah, there it is, guys. Quite a bit long meta report video. I do apologize for that. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hopefully this was interesting to you guys. And it was certainly very interesting to me. I was away this weekend, but I was keeping my eye on the tournament. And to come back and see the results of this 3,000 player tournament, again, the largest Pokemon Pocket tournament of all time, was certainly really, really fun to take a look at and also really interesting. And again, I think that this is the best format we've had so far by a wide margin. And I honestly, I chalk that up mostly to Rare Candy making a lot of these decks a bit more viable and at least helping these Stage 2 decks be a little bit more on par with the basic EX Pokemon decks, but also Oricorio, which did get its first official win. So there's something. I believe Snorlax won the first week, which beat a Magnezone Oricorio in the finals. Week 2 was won by Tapu Lele, which I think beat Giratina and Darkrai in the finals. And then this week, Magnezone and Oricorio won while beating Grass in the finals. So, you can kind of see there's a lot of decks that have placed really, really well. And I'm excited to see what next weekend holds. It'll be a smaller tournament, but it'll still be really fun to take a look at. And then tomorrow, we'll do our tier list and we'll talk really in depth about where I really rank a lot of these decks from a tier list perspective, which maybe you guys are interested in, maybe not, but I think that the tier list tomorrow is going to look a lot different than it has in the previous weeks, and I think a big reason for that is the impact that the results of this tournament will have on what decks people play and what the metagame looks like overall. Really fun, and then realistically, we've got like another week and a half, and then the next set will probably be announced, and things will change tremendously yet again. The crazy world of Pokemon Pocket, which I love, and I love covering on YouTube. So thank you guys so much for watching. Peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys next time. Like and subscribe. Stay tuned. Tier list tomorrow. And yeah, bye.